In the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford sits a small, unassuming block of baked clay, no larger than a human hand. Yet it holds a secret that threatens to unravel the entire timeline of human civilization. Known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, this four-sided artifact, covered in dense columns of cuneiform script, is one of the most explosive documents ever recovered from the ancient world, a surviving fragment of a lost era that defies every convention of modern history. Discovered in 1922 during an expedition to the ancient city of Larsa by the British archaeologist Herbert Weld-Blundell, it dates back to around 1800 BC, but the information it carries claims to be thousands of years older, a direct transmission from the dawn of time when the boundary between the divine and the mortal was dangerously thin. This is the Sumerian King List, a bureaucratic record of every ruler who held the staff of power in Mesopotamia, detailing their names, their capital cities, and the lengths of their reigns in a matter-of-fact tone that suggests absolute historical accuracy. At first glance, it appears to be a standard historical chronicle, a dry list of succession for the Sumerian state intended to legitimize the rule of the Isin dynasty by connecting them to an ancient lineage. But as scholars began to translate the opening lines, the mundane dissolved into the impossible, revealing a narrative that no historian could easily explain away. The list does not begin with a human chieftain, a tribal warlord, or a recognizable political figure. It begins with a phrase that chills the blood of historians. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This singular sentence fundamentally alters the origin story of our species, implying that the institution of government was not a gradual social evolution, but an alien technology, a divine imposition gifted to humanity from the sky. What follows is a list of 8 kings who ruled for a total of 241,200 years, shattering every known biological limit of the human species and presenting a version of history where a single monarch could reign for an epoch that spans the rise and fall of glaciers. This single object forces us to confront a terrifying choice. Either the ancient Sumerians were recording a history of mythology so potent they treated it as fact, confusing metaphors with reality, or they were faithfully remembering a time when the rulers of humanity were not fully human at all, preserving the memory of a golden age that has since been washed away by time and catastrophe. The prism sits silently in its glass case, a testament to a forgotten epoch, challenging us to ask if our history books are incomplete or if the ancients simply knew something about the nature of time and life that we have long since forgotten. The first section of the King List, known as the antediluvian or pre-flood portion, reads like a fever dream of immortality, presenting a genealogy of rulers whose lifespans are so vast they seem geological rather than biological. The text states with clinical precision, in Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alaungar ruled for 36,000 years. These are not typos or translation errors. The scribe uses specific numerical units, SARS, 3,600 years, and NUS, 600 years, to record these epochs with unwavering accuracy, treating a reign of 30 millennia with the same bureaucratic indifference as a reign of 30 years. The list continues, moving the seat of power to Bad Tibra, where Enminluana rules for 43,200 years, the longest reign of any individual in human history, a span of time that would see the emergence and extinction of entire megafauna species. Skeptics and mainstream historians argue that these numbers are symbolic, mathematical cycles based on the sexagesimal system, base 60, used by Sumerian astronomers, representing the supreme importance of these figures rather than literal time, a way of saying they were larger than life. Yet, the text presents them without a hint of allegory, listing their capital cities, Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larak, Sapar, Shurapak, as physical places that archaeologists have actually excavated, finding real temples and real foundations beneath the desert sand. The list demands that we accept a world where the boundary between the divine and the mortal was non-existent, and where a single life could span the rise and fall of civilizations. It forces us to ask, were these years calculated differently, referring to days or lunar cycles, Or are we looking at the reign of entities whose biology was fundamentally different from our own? The sheer consistency of the record suggests that for the Sumerians, these were not myths, but historical facts, the foundational truths of their world which described a time when men of renown walked the earth and ruled for eons, leaving a legacy that would haunt the collective memory of the Near East for thousands of years to come. Then, the narrative abruptly stops, the rhythm of the list shattered by a cataclysmic event that serves as the great dividing line of Sumerian history, separating the dream time of the gods from the hard reality of men. The hundreds of thousands of years of reign are cut short by a single, devastating sentence. The flood swept over. Unlike the biblical account, which focuses on the moral cleansing of sin and the salvation of the righteous, the King List treats the flood as a political disaster, a massive inundation that forced the institution of kingship to be resent from the heavens a second time, rebooting the system of government in a ruined world. The specificity of the phrase swept over, Amaru in Sumerian, suggests a physical inundation of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain, a megaflood that buried the cities of the 240,000-year kings under meters of silt, erasing their palaces and their people in a single stroke. This moment marks the transition from the mythical era to the quasi-historical era, a shift that is reflected immediately in the numbers. The kings who rule immediately after the flood, starting with the first dynasty of Kish, still boast immense lifespans, but they are drastically reduced from tens of thousands of years to mere hundreds, signaling a degradation in the bloodline or a fundamental change in the environment. We are watching the slow decay of the divine vitality, a genetic or magical entropy recorded in the regnal years, as the rulers of Earth become less like gods and more like men with each passing generation. The King List thus serves as the original book of Genesis, preserving the memory of a global cataclysm that severed humanity from its golden age, a trauma so deep that it bifurcated time itself into before and after. It suggests that the history of human civilization is not a straight line of progress, but a broken path, interrupted by a disaster that nearly ended the story before it truly began, leaving the survivors to rebuild among the ruins of giants whose longevity they could remember but never again achieve. As the list marches forward in time, traversing the dynasties that rose from the mud of the post-flood world, it slowly bleeds into the reality we recognize, transitioning from the impossible to the plausible. By the time we reach the legendary Gilgamesh, the fifth king of Uruk, the reigns have dropped to a reasonable 126 years, still superhuman by modern standards, but approaching the outer limits of biological possibility. Gilgamesh is the pivot point of the entire document, the tragic figure who straddles the line between the ancient demigods and the modern kings, famously searching for the immortality that his ancestors Alulum and Alaungar possessed naturally, only to fail and accept his mortality. His presence in the list anchors the mythology in a tangible figure, a king who built the walls of Uruk and whose deeds were celebrated in the world's first epic, validating the list as a blend of history and memory. Following Gilgamesh, the lifespans collapse further, settling into the normal human range of 6, 20, or 36 years, indistinguishable from the reigns of kings in recorded history. Historians view this as a political tool, a propaganda piece created by the Isin dynasty to legitimize their rule by connecting themselves to this unbroken chain reaching back to the gods, asserting that their authority was identical to that of Alulum himself. But for the alternative historian, the list remains a stubborn anomaly, a document that refuses to be dismissed as mere fiction. It implies that the history of our species is far older and stranger than we admit, and that the myths of the Golden Age were actually memories of a time when the atmosphere, the genetics, or the gods themselves allowed for a life without a horizon. The Weld-Blundell Prism sits in its glass case in Oxford not just as a record of names, but as a tombstone for a lost version of humanity, a testament to a time when kings were immortal, and the flood had not yet come to wash the magic away, leaving us to wonder if we are the pinnacle of evolution or merely the faded remnants of something far greater. While the numbers in the Sumerian King List are often dismissed as mere mythology or political propaganda, a closer examination reveals a startling consistency with other ancient traditions, particularly the biblical genealogies found in the book of Genesis. Just as the Sumerian kings rule for tens of thousands of years before a catastrophic flood reduces their lifespans, the biblical patriarchs from Adam to Noah live for nearly a millennium. Adam for 930 years, Methuselah for 969, before the deluge resets the biological clock, causing the ages of their descendants to plummet rapidly to 120, then 70 years. This parallelism suggests that both the Hebrew scribes and the Sumerian priests were drawing from a shared, primordial memory of a time when human longevity was fundamentally different, a golden age where the rules of aging did not apply. The correlation goes even deeper when we examine the structure of the lists. Both traditions feature a specific number of generations, 10 in the Bible, 8 to 10 in various Sumerian tablets, bridging the gap between the creation of man and the Great Flood, culminating in a hero, Zeusidra in Sumer, Noah in Israel, who survives the cataclysm to repopulate the earth. This structural identity implies that these are not independent inventions, but divergent records of the same historical reality, filtered through different cultural lenses. Skeptics argue that the Hebrews simply borrowed and adapted the Sumerian myths during the Babylonian exile, shrinking the unbelievable 30,000-year reigns to believable 900-year lifespans to fit their theological narrative. However, proponents of the ancient astronaut theory or alternative history offer a more radical interpretation, that both lists are accurate in their own way, recording a genetic or environmental degradation that occurred after a planetary disaster. They suggest that the years in the king list might represent a different unit of time, or that the kings were not human at all, but rather extraterrestrial overseers or genetically engineered hybrids whose biology allowed for extreme longevity. In this view, the descent of kingship from heaven is a literal description of a non-human governance structure established on Earth, and the subsequent decline in lifespans marks the gradual dilution of this alien DNA within the human gene pool. Whether one views these parallels as evidence of cultural diffusion or a garbled memory of a lost epoch, the king list stands as a crucial piece of the puzzle, linking the sacred history of the Bible with the civic history of Mesopotamia and pointing to a shared origin for the strangest stories of our past. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Sumerian king list is not just who is on it, but who is missing, and the curious silence regarding the rise of the Akkadian Empire and other rival states suggests that the document was never meant to be a comprehensive history, but rather a specific political argument frozen in clay. The list presents the concept of kingship as a singular, indivisible object that is passed from one city to another, from Eridu to Kish to Uruk to Uar, implying that there was always only one legitimate ruler of Mesopotamia at any given time. We know from archaeological evidence that this was false. City-states like Lagash and Umma flourished simultaneously, often warring with each other. Yet the king list ignores these concurrent dynasties, forcing a linear narrative onto a chaotic reality. This selective editing reveals the list's true purpose. It was a tool of legitimacy, likely compiled during the Isen-Larsa period, circa 2000 to 1800 BC, to justify the claim of the Isen kings to supreme authority by drawing a direct, unbroken line from themselves back to the gods. However, this manipulation does not explain the antediluvian section. In fact, it makes it even more puzzling. Why not start with a believable hero like Gilgamesh? The inclusion of the long count kings suggests that this pre-flood tradition was so deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness that it could not be ignored. It was the accepted truth of the time, a foundational myth that every Sumerian believed, much like the Big Bang or the theory of evolution today. To omit Alulim in the pre-flood era would have been to deny the very origins of their civilization. Thus, the list is a hybrid document, part political spin, part sacred history, blending the cynical needs of the present with the mystical memories of the past. It forces us to peel back the layers of propaganda to find the kernel of truth hidden in the numbers, the persistent belief that before the cities of men were built, the cities of God stood in their place, ruled by beings who watched the stars turn for millennia. If we take the ancient astronaut or paleocontact hypothesis seriously, The Sumerian King List becomes the primary text for arguing that human civilization was not a self-generated phenomenon, but an uplift project initiated by advanced beings. The opening phrase, "kingship descended from heaven," is interpreted literally. Governance, law, and social order were brought to earth by the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. In this framework, the extreme longevity of the first kings is explained not as magic, but as biology. If these rulers were extraterrestrial entities or their direct hybrid offspring, their lifespans would naturally far exceed those of the indigenous humans they ruled. The mathematical precision of the SARS, 3,600 years, aligns with the proposed orbital period of their home planet, Nibiru, as popularized by Zacharias Sitchin, suggesting that their reign lengths were calculated in their own planetary cycles rather than Earth years. The King List, then, is a record of the colonial governors of Earth, listing the tenure of each commander before the mission was aborted or altered by the Great Flood. The flood itself is reinterpreted not as a divine punishment, but as a natural catastrophe, a glacial melt or asteroid impact, that the non-human leadership anticipated but could not fully prevent, forcing them to evacuate, ascend to heaven, and leave humanity to fend for itself. The post-flood decline in lifespans represents the transition from direct alien rule to human proxy rule, where the demigods, like Gilgamesh, who was 2/3 god, 1/3 man, tried desperately to maintain the old order but ultimately succumbed to their human mortality. This theory, while rejected by mainstream academia as pseudoscience, offers a coherent, if fantastic, explanation for every anomaly in the list: the sudden appearance of the state, the impossible ages, the obsession with bloodlines, and the abrupt shift after the deluge. It reframes the King List from a boring administrative tablet into a disclosure document, a fragment of the logbook left behind by the architects of the human race, recording the shift change before the lights went out. Ultimately, the Weld-Blundell Prism leaves us staring into the abyss of deep time, holding a mirror that reflects a version of humanity we barely recognize, forcing us to ask whether we have forgotten who we are or if we never really knew. Whether you view the Sumerian King List as a masterpiece of political propaganda, a garbled collection of agricultural myths, or the literal history of an extraterrestrial occupation, its power lies in its refusal to be ordinary. It is a document that asserts, with absolute bureaucratic confidence, that the human story did not begin with stone tools and campfire stories, but with cities, kings, and a direct line to the stars. It challenges the modern linear view of history, the idea that we are the smartest, most advanced people to ever walk the earth, by presenting a past where men of renown lived for eons and accomplished feats we can only dream of. The list stands as a silent monument to the fragility of memory. If a civilization as great as Sumer could forget the true nature of its own origins, blurring the line between history and myth until the two became indistinguishable, what have we forgotten? What truths about our own time will be reduced to myths in 5,000 years? As we continue to dig in the sands of Iraq, searching for the ruins of Eridu and Shurapak, we are looking for more than just pottery and walls. We are looking for the physical proof of the impossible reigns recorded on that clay prism. Until we find the bones of a 30,000-year-old king, the list remains an enigma, a locked door at the beginning of history. The King List is not just a record of the past. It is a question mark hanging over the future, asking if the kingship will ever descend from heaven again.